has Algeria become? I want to also thank ahead of time 𝐘𝐞𝐚𝐫𝐬, who was a visiting research scholar at Harvard University, for organizing this, also with a very able cooperation with our academic and our physical neighbor next door, Hugh Roberts, who is the Edward Keller Professor of North Africa and the Middle East at Tufts University. I also want to welcome Salim Othmani, who's the president of 𝐘𝐟 in Algeria and MEF in Tunisia, and Professor Zahia Smail-Salhi, who was a professor of modern Arabic studies at the University of Manchester. I'll turn over the duties to my esteemed colleague, Adil, who will take over from here. But again, I want to welcome you all to this very timely and very important webinar. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. Salam alaikum. Bonjour. Azul. Thanks so much, Professor 𝐺𝐵, for this very kind introduction. We're honored you are here with us, especially given that it's, if I may share with colleagues, this is your last event as director at CMES, Harvard CMES, but by no means the last event in general. I'd like to welcome our speakers and participants to this afternoon's event. As Professor 𝐺𝐵 had outlined, we're talking here today about 60 years after independence. What has Algeria become? Or in درجة بعد 60 سنة من استقلال وش ولينا وش ولات, or وين وصلت الجزائر in درجة, and Professor 𝐺𝐵 will do a better job on the Fusha for sure. I'm delighted to be moderating this webinar panel. We have a truly star-studded lineup, as was mentioned just a second ago of Professor 𝐺𝐵's initial intros of who we have with us today. We have scholars and practitioners who have an intimate relationship with Algeria through blood, sweat, scholarship, and treasure, and we'll intro them fully in just a moment. So planning to cover a lot of ground, but we'll aim to remain wedded to the exam question where possible. So just a little recap and some of the big questions we sort of plan to explore. We're marking Algeria's 60 years of independence next Tuesday. It is specifically on the 5th of July. So just after a day after a slightly more recognized Independence Day. And now looking back post-independence, Algeria was heralded as a champion of anti-colonial struggles, a symbol of the non-aligned movement, a bastion of third worldism, a mecca of revolutions, as it were. But it soon faced diminishing returns on its soft power capital, as it were, and the world changed around it, right? So despite much experimentation in the economic space, here I'm thinking agrarian, industry, etc., and some would argue pseudo-experimentation in the political and social realm, Algeria is yet to see a full, if you like, 30-year run at development or steady development due to oil price volatility, la décennie noire or black decade of the 90s, and more recently with the Iraq movement and COVID-19, even more recently. So in 62, just a couple of quick stats and facts to sort of provide some mini context before handing over to the experts. Algeria's population in 62 at independence was just a mere 11 million. In 1988, for those that know why I'm referring to that year, at the beginning of Algeria's October riots, we were at 24 million. And we're now at around 44 million, give or take, more recently with the market, with the Iraq movement and COVID-19. Between the 80s and now, we've seen, like I said, a significant rise in population and urbanization, but it hasn't been commensurate in growth with oil production and growth in general, economic growth. Socioeconomically, as alluded to in a blurb, Algeria made great strides in literacy, education space, but after achieving this sort of massification of education, including for women, which Professor Zahia will, I'm sure, touch on, like in most developing countries, it is now the quality of education and the development of, I'm going to say, independent private sector, willing to take people on that is most required, and for many a sine qua non. So today we're sort of asking the questions, what do transformations, change and continuities look like in the Algerian political, economic, demographic, social landscape? What are the birthmarks, to still use terms, have been retained? And what is or remains exceptional about Algeria, this Mediterranean middle power, this largest country in Africa and the Arab world? A country, in my estimation, and this goes for all Middle Eastern studies, though, under Professor 𝐺𝐵's leadership, the CMES does give an appropriate focus on the Maghreb, and Bill is speaking to us from Tunis. But it's really one of the most under-researched countries, pound for pound, in the Anglosphere bar none almost, and you know that's up for debate. If you sort of think about analysts and observers alike, they use interesting language when discussing Algeria: opacity, unusual, different, complicated are words that come to mind, alongside, of course, beautiful, stunning, diverse, for those that have been. Now, in juxtaposition of US independence, we are going to ask, where did Algeria deviate from the vision of its own founding fathers? What for ideology? From socialism and state capitalism to crony capitalism, perhaps. What are the various fault lines? And we hope to explore that today. So thinking of simplistic typologies, perhaps, authoritarianism, democracy, secularism, Islamism, West, East, rentier, productive, and then the linguistic pluralisms of, you know, thinking about French, Arabization, Darija, Amazigh, and so on. And then really sort of thinking finally about how has the social contract evolved, right? I always think about a toolkit of R's, of rent, reform, religion, revolution, and there's another R which I'll leave to colleagues perhaps for the conversation. Now for house rules and to introduce our speakers, following some initial remarks of around 7 to 8 minutes each from our 3 speakers, we'll enter a virtual cafe and bring your lattes or qahwa or whatever you like, and we'll have more of a conversation. So more dynamic Q&A, and backstage I ask colleagues that we encourage healthy debate and 2-finger healthy interventions the right way around. You'll see that we don't have a Q&A function, but a chat function. You can share your short questions that is, not statements or khutbas, as a colleague put it earlier on. And we'll call on you to unmute. The shorter, the sweeter, the more likely we are to call upon you. So no statements or essays. And I think, you know, once you get to sort of debate stage, you can start to put your questions in, and we'll call on you and unmute. With no further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers, our August speakers. And if you, I'm going to sort of go through all bios at once, and then I'll turn over to Professor Roberts, who'll kick us off. So in the spirit of austerity and for purposes of time, I've asset stripped the bios of Tad. So we're very privileged and very happy to have Professor Hugh Roberts, who's Edward Keller Professor of North African and Middle Eastern History at Tufts University. Hugh graduated BA through DPhil, aka PhD, from Oxford, where he undertook doctoral research on and in Algeria, and where he taught English in Bouira in the Kabylia region of Algeria. He's also spent another year as French government scholar at the University of Aix-Marseille. He taught politics and political history at the University of East Anglia before pursuing independent scholarship, later returning as a senior research fellow at the LSE. He subsequently moved to Cairo, where he lived throughout the 2000s, 01 to 12, continuing work on Algeria and additionally on Egyptian political history and the history of Islamism. He also worked for ICG as director of its North Africa project. And finally, he also taught at the University of Sussex, Berkeley, UC Berkeley, and the School of Oriental and African Studies. Having published millions of articles and books, that's not in his bio, I've added that. I added perhaps 2 notable mentions, which are his books on the battlefield, Algeria 1988 to 2002, Studies in a Broken Polity, and Berber Government, the Kabyle Polity in Pre-Colonial Algeria. We also have Professor Zahia Ismail-Salhi, who is Professor of Modern Arabic Studies at the University of Manchester. Zahia received her doctorate from the University of Exeter. She taught at the University of Leeds from 98 to 2012. She joined the University of Manchester as Chair of Modern Arabic in 2013. Zahia has held positions as co-director for the Center for the Advanced Study of the Arab World. She was executive director of BRISMIS, or British Society of Middle East Studies. She was also associate editor of the British Journal of Middle Eastern Studies, and serves as a member of the editorial board of Women's Studies International Forum. In the field of Arabic literature, she served as a member of the Committee of Judges of the International Prize for Arabic Fiction, and a member of the Committee of Judges of the Saif Robash Banital Prize for Arabic Literary Translation. Zahia has also published widely on her primary research interests of literature and culture of MENA and Middle East gender studies, particularly focused on Algeria, the Maghreb, and Saudi Arabia. And last but not least, old friend Slim Othmani, who is the founder and president of Club d'Action et de Réflexion de l'Entreprise, or CARE, the first Algerian think tank, and also the co-founder and president of the Maghreb Economic Forum Tunisia. Formerly CEO of Ruiba, he is now chairman of the board. Slim received the Légion d'honneur by the French government in June 2018 for his commitment to improve business environment in Algeria and strengthen ties between France and Algeria. Hugh, in 7 minutes, can you take us through 6 decades? Marhaba, bienvenue, over to you. You're on mute, Hugh.
I was counting on 8 minutes there, Adel. Okay, Algeria. What has Algeria become? This was the theme I was asked to address. It's become the largest country in Africa, but through no fault of its own. That's a function of the Sudan's loss of its southern region. It's an economy massively dependent on hydrocarbons and the revenues from the export of these, and that dependence is continuing and very problematic. One might even say dangerous for Algeria. It's a distributive state. Its fundamental role, the fundamental role of the state in the economic sphere being the allocation of the revenues from hydrocarbon sales. It's a Muslim state for a Muslim people. And that's an important fact about it that I think is not sufficiently taken on board by many commentators. It's also a national security state. Dealing with issues that produce tension and security concerns on all sides. There has, of course, been at home an important internal security problem culminating in the...
Sorry, Hugh, you just went on mute. Could you unmute? Thanks.
I don't know how that happened. I don't know what I missed, but I'm talking about the state being a national security state amongst other facets. There was, of course, a terrible period of violence in the 1990s. There's residual internal security problems in certain districts, but for the vast bulk of the country, peace and order and security was established quite some time ago, re-established. But abroad, the Algerian state faces difficulties, security issues on all sides. Of course, a long-standing conflict with Morocco, great concern about its Libyan frontier, given the collapse of the Libyan state, concerns about its frontier with Tunisia, where there's been a jihadi activity in Mount Shambi, but there's good cooperation with the Tunisian authorities. Also concern on its southern flank with Niger and Mali because of the Tuareg questions, not to mention, of course, a degree of concern in its relations with Western Sahara and Mauritania. So it has security concerns, and these are, in a sense, permanent, certainly chronic, and that affects the outlook of the government. On the whole, it's been a very effective and respected player in the international arena with a reputation for resourceful diplomacy and a talent for skillful negotiation and hard bargaining. Internally, it's been, I would say, a conservative regime since around 1979, 1980. It was not a conservative regime under President Boumediene, who had ambitious projects, chief of which, in my view, was the project of industrialization. And that project was largely abandoned by Boumediene's successors, the regime of President Chadli Ben-Jadid, and that has had long-term consequences. Adel already mentioned some of the key transformations that have occurred over the last 60 years, quadrupling of the population. And just imagine the amount of stress that the government has had to handle and cope with as a consequence of that, from 11 to 44, 45 million. The transformation from a predominantly rural population to one that is now 75% urban. That also a huge change. The expansion of education already referred to. In my view, a really considerable success in the promotion of literacy. Literacy is now over 81%. It was around 15% at independence, much lower than it had been before the French conquest. In my view, also a broadly successful promotion, however controversial, of the Arabic language. To restore it to its status as the premier language of Algeria, the first national language. And although that has led to lots of debate and controversy and some resentment, it on the whole, I think, has been a success. And they've managed to do this while also eventually coming around to provide recognition to the Berber language, Tamazight, as a national language and as an official language. And that's, in my view, shows a certain amount of skill, even if it's taken longer than many people have wanted. Zahia will talk about the other great transformation in the status and life chances of Algerian women, so I'll leave that to her. I think the great failure, and I don't wish to be unfair about this, has been the failure to break out of the dependence on hydrocarbons revenues as a consequence of abandoning not simply the socialist approach of the Boumediene era to industrialization, but not failing to replace that with a non-socialist alternative that actually addressed the problem that Algeria needs to develop its production, manufacturing outside the hydrocarbon sector if it is to provide jobs for the ever-growing population. And this is a great weakness, a great failure. It's a premise of a major problem in the state-society relationship affecting and articulated by Algerian youth above all, the problem that they call al-hagra, or la hogra, as the French insist on calling it, meaning the experience of being treated with contempt by office holders abusing their power, of being denied rights that they are at least theoretically entitled to, of being neglected. And this is particularly acutely felt by the young unemployed. And this leads to the second phenomenon that is in a way a dishonor to Algeria, of young people desperately trying to cross the Mediterranean because they see no future for themselves in Algeria. These are great weaknesses. They are symptomatic of a broader problem, in my view, in the state-society relationship arising out of the awkward legacy of the war. The war established, the FLN-ALN during the war established a kind of sacred union of the army and the people. And that was a great achievement in the context of confronting France. And the army takes the view that that union has to be maintained at all costs indefinitely. And I'm not going to argue with that. The problem is that it continues to be interpreted for practical purposes in a very, if you like, authoritarian manner, a military manner. The military has a tradition of expecting orders to be obeyed. The military is not very good at allowing civil society to breathe and to do its own thing. And the conservatism of the regime in these respects has actually been aggravated by the decision to introduce a degree of pluralism from 1989 onwards that was greeted with joy by many people at the time. But the pluralism in question was above all a pluralism of different kinds of competing identity politics. Berberism, Islamism, secularism as a kind of militant identity, and so forth. And the problem with this is that it didn't provide real representation to the society. And the society has become disillusioned with this pluralism, as the figures for turnout in elections demonstrate. We had 59% voting in the National Assembly elections in 1991, 65.6 in 1997, 23% a year ago. There's been a vertiginous drop in public endorsement of the political system. Fewer and fewer bother to vote because they are basically saying, we are voting with our feet. This is not a system that provides us with representation or the opportunity to participate properly. And that in a way is partly because of the kind of limited and frustrating pluralism of identity politics, which the Algerians, I think, in general are sick of. They actually don't really want to have Berber versus Arabic versus Islam versus secularism played off again and again and again. They want other more important problems addressed, and the political system is not responding. And that is a great weakness, I think, and something that we're still waiting for elements of the public to emerge capable of advocating and articulating a vision for realizable and practical change. The 𝐘𝐟𝐭𝐞𝐫 movement of a couple of years ago demonstrated the yearning of the Algerian public for something better, but this was expressed very largely in traditional Islamic morality terms. The idea that everyone in the regime should clear off expressed a kind of desire for a purification of Algerian politics. That's a very traditional Islamic idea. It didn't involve any kind of coherent or practicable constitutional proposition, and that was the great weakness of the 𝐘𝐟𝐭𝐞𝐫. So we have an open-ended situation. I can't help thinking that Algeria deserves congratulations on still being there after 60 years, despite having many enemies. But it needs to face up to some problems that are in part, at any rate, the product of an awkward legacy and the need for imaginative thinking to enable it to innovate within the framework of its own national traditions. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugh, for such a robust and broad initial overview. Thank you for covering 6 decades and 6 themes in 8 minutes. We'll come back to some of those big picture points, and I'd love you to come back to this, this deviation or fundamental changes that the forefathers or founding fathers would have hoped to see in 2022, back between 54 and 62. We'd now like to fly from Cambridge or Medford, Massachusetts to Leeds in Yorkshire to Professor Salhi, so it's a bit of mileage there. And Zahi is going to take us through, I believe, aided by slides, with an overview of the role of women and how the role of women has evolved over the past 6 decades as a lens to understand societal change in Algeria. Zahi, over to you.
Thank you very much, Adil. It's a very great pleasure to be here and to participate to this interesting forum. Now, to ask a question, what has Algeria become in the last 60 years? I think it's not easy to understand without reaching back to possibly much longer before the 60 years. I will share my presentation with you. I whizzed through it, so it's just there for you to see. Let me find it. Hopefully it's this one. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
I would like to start from here. So basically, in order to understand what has Algeria become, what has it achieved in the last 60 years, it's very important to see its trajectory from the occupation, French occupation, until today. And Algeria, especially when we speak about women, they have entered modern history through their participation in national resistance against colonial France. And that's when Algerian, I think this notion of Algerian women was born, in my opinion. There was no such talk about Algerian women prior to that. So their first appearance was as warriors. They have made their appearance right from the beginning in 1830 as foot soldiers in the conquest or in the resistance against the conquest. And that was followed by the rebellion by Lalla Fatma. And it's very important to really highlight this because women who have been invisibilized, exoticized, etc. So we have to show this other face of Algerian women. Lalla Fatma Soumer, a great leader who led a rebellion from 1851 until 1860. And then, of course, their roles as warriors followed on to the War of Independence until Algeria won its independence in 1962. They were also seen as sites of cultural resistance. And it's very important to look at this phenomenon because all the conservatism of today's society in Algeria, I think, has its roots in the colonial phenomenon that they were the ones preserving national identity in the homes, restoring this national identity and keeping it alive through 132 years of acculturation. So this is really very important to bear in mind when looking into Algerian women, and things haven't changed and they are the same in the present. So during colonial time, French were very aware about this role that women played and therefore targeted them as sites of assimilation. And this, of course, was theorized extensively by Frantz Fanon, and I have got quotes here for you to see. And then, of course, the nationalists, when they saw that the French were targeting Algerian women as sites of for assimilation, in order to assimilate the whole society, you need to target the women, then they became of interest to the nationalists as well. Although the nationalists have always perceived that there's no women's question for as long as Algeria was colonized, they soon realized that women should be integrated, and therefore that led to the birth of the Algerian feminist movement in 1943 under the aegis of the Communist Party. The first appearance of Algerian women in modern history in the 20th century, that is, was during the tragic events of 1945, when Algerians were celebrating the armistice, and then the crowds were shot by the settlers. And this is when women intervened to nurse the injured and look after the families, etc., etc. And also, this is the first time they have led and participated in political demonstrations. So this really is a very important moment in history, which built up to the National War of Independence. I don't want to give you all these statistics, but I thought I would put them here just to show the significance of their contribution. It's not a minimal contribution, it's a very important one, without which, and this is testimony of many people, especially war veterans I interviewed, without the help of women, this revolution would not have lived for eight years to lead into independence. And here you have an example of all the things that they have done during this revolution. In brief, they facilitated the continuance of the War of Independence and its success. Obviously, this, of course, was praised by Frantz Fanon and many theorists, Frantz Fanon saying that they were the hallmark of a national revolution's potential to liberate women. So by liberating the nation, that's the only way women could liberate themselves. What is important in this contribution to the war operations is how this role has changed the whole society and challenged patriarchy. And in fact, at this moment in history, there was a lot of hopes that Algerian women would have constructed an image for themselves that would lead into post-colonial Algeria, having these women being full agents, etc., etc. We will come more into that in a moment. Now, there is a lot of talk about these women having become the incarnation of the country. And very famous of this is what Verger had said when he was set to defend Jamila Bouhired when she was arrested and tortured in colonial prisons. He said that when he saw her, she looked, if Algeria had a face, it would have been that of Jamila, and this is Jamila, the face of Algeria. Now, it is thanks to the women of the likes of Jamila that the Algerian revolution has managed to become globalized, or to reach the global scale. And you could see the reactions that I have listed here for you from Switzerland, from the Soviet Union then, from Egypt, from India, all the way to the UK, where 76 British MPs sent a letter to President 𝐀𝐿 demanding grace for Jamila, and many others did the same, and many, many marches were organized across the world. So what I'm trying to say here, it's this emergence of women helped Algeria emerge on the global scale. And prior to that, Algerian, or the revolution was not even given the name of a revolution or a national independence movement. It was seen as a terrorist organization, terrorist movement, etc., etc. Now, after all this, what happens in the post-independence period? Now, of course, because of these roles that women played in the war, the FLN declared that Algerian women won their rights and they deserved to be full and unconditional citizens. And this promise was kept by the first rulers of Algeria, especially Boumediene, who in the 1976 charter emphasized the efforts of the state, emphasized the efforts the state should deploy to grant women their political rights and to fight against backward mentalities, meaning both the feudal system, Islamic conservatism, or fundamentalism. So unlike Tunisia and Morocco, that put in place family codes immediately after independence, Boumediene and his team were against that. That was a means to segregate against women, and he wanted women to be full citizens just in the way they have been throughout the history of Algeria, during especially the War of Independence. However, when I look personally into the early years of independence, what I see is what I call a feminist regression. What happened to these women who made the tabloids, the women who went into the maquis or the bush without the consent of their parents, the women who really defeated patriarchy? What is this return to the home, to conservative values. Why is it happening? So there are many answers that we can provide. And I have to say there is very few studies that took interest in this early period. What happened to the women? What's going on? In my view, there needed some coaching. A lot of women felt like the liberation of the nation was a national duty and it wasn't questionable. And there's also a sense of fatigue. A lot of women felt they were tired after 8 years of war and that they needed to found homes and have children, you know, etc., etc. And at the same time, the state has launched what we call the UNFA, the National Union of Algerian Women, which is an organization, part of state feminism that was meant to promote women. But unfortunately, this organization failed in fulfilling its role to emancipate women, to spread awareness amongst women, and it became just an organization that we saw during parties or during national celebrations, etc., etc. So I think this is the hole in the history that needs a lot of research to be looked into. And it is this that led
Can you start to wrap up, Zahi, if that's okay? Just
okay, I will do quickly. And this is really what led into the promulgation of the family code in 1984, 22 years after independence. Women are turned into second-class citizens after they were full citizens, which was really a big setback. So in terms of wrapping up, so I would say like just carrying on quickly, the 1980s has been a bad period because following the death of President Boumediene, his successor gave in to the pressure of the fundamentalists, which led into the promulgation of this code of infamy, as I call it. But there is good news in that because this really was a wake-up call for women, and it is just now, after this betrayal, that they thought, okay, enough slumber, enough relying on the state. It is now time to organize as feminist activist groups. And here is the rebirth, I would say, of the Algerian feminist movement. However, not very long after that, we have seen the Black Decade, in which we have seen women becoming the main target of the Islamic terrorists. Women were not intimidated by this, but they led a dual fight. On the one hand, they continued to fight for the abrogation of the family code. On the other hand, they fought against Islamic fundamentalism by resisting this movement, really doing everything they didn't want them to do, continuing to promote life and hope in the society, despite violence reaching alarming levels amounting to femicide, as I call it in a few of my articles. So this, again, what I would say here, the women of Algeria came out of this Black Decade, I would say, triumphant, because first of all, they regained feminist awareness. Second, they have resisted a most barbaric movement, and they have done so in many ways, but they have gained terrain. When the male members were leaving the country or crossing the Mediterranean to go somewhere else, women stayed on the ground and took positions that were traditionally designated as male positions. There are also gains I would like to highlight here. Of course, 1962 independence brought a lot of gains for women. First of all, I would say the high levels of illiteracy, I would say more than 90% of women were illiterate at independence. And now we have seen a lot of achievements because education was made compulsory and free. And that resulted in the following statistics. If you look, you will see that 70%, women make up 70% of Algeria's lawyers, 60% of its judges. And in the area of the media, 61% of journalists are women. And of course, they have also entered the political arena. The National People's Assembly is made of 32% of women, and the Council of the Nations has 7% of women. Algeria has the first woman to be,
lead a political
for
party.
the elections, etc. So I think I should end it here. But there are a lot of gains. We cannot really say it's all doom and gloom. There's a lot of gains. The terrain is for women. It's up to them to organize and to militate. I want just one more thing. Although in terms of labor, statistics say there's only 20% of women who are employed. I would have to say that 100% of women are employed, but they are working in the invisible economy. So there's a lot of awareness, a lot of contribution, and women continue to be dynamic. And I will hope to answer more questions if there is more. This is all I could give in this short time.
Thank you so much, Zahi. And actually, your last point provides an incredible segue for Slim, because it touches on the economy and it touches on the informal sector. And we spoke of social contracts and taxation representation nexuses, which Hugh implied and inferred in his opening remarks. So we'd like to go to Slim, flying from Yorkshire to Algiers. Slim, could you, in 7-8 minutes, provide a perspective on the economy and business?
Thank you, Adel, and thanks to everyone. Let me start by a few things, very easy. Let's make a stop in 1962. 1962, although the people celebrate their independence with joy and happiness, on the same day, the famous invisible genius of the city, in reference to the book of an Italian called Guglielmo Ferrero in 1943, they come into action. Algeria is already in turmoil, but it doesn't know it yet. She will quickly understand this at her expense. This is what, throughout the past 60 years, has conditioned his political and economical trajectory. It's very important to understand that, because all the international supporters of the war of liberation are waiting for the return of the elevator. It's a French expression that says, I gave you, so you must give me. Barely settled, the country reminds its population and its supporters the fundamental pillars that will guide it. 5 markers, you call it, I think, in your opening remark, Algeria birthmark. They are still present. Islam, Arabization, the Palestinian cause, a generous socialism, and an unwavering support for the liberation movements. To others, and to those, to those who have helped Algeria, therefore, Algeria makes the choice to please some and displease others, those people that helped Algeria during the independence war. And this, regardless of the aid provided during the war years. All this without counting on the former colonizer who will surf on these inconsistencies to carry out a behind-the-scene work to keep control of his former colony. It's very important to understand that. There is games. I'm saying that because this is a real balancing act that this country imposed to itself, and also despite itself, and which will not be without consequences. The international context of the time, characterized by the Cold War and the rise of Arab nationalism, largely influenced what appear to be thoughtful strategic choices. I think they are not. Objectively, we have to be fair with Algeria. It is often said that Algeria is paranoid, which is what is mainly handicapped its development. Certainly, many reasons would be there to justify it, as the country contains so much wealth. However, nothing can justify the inertia in which Algeria is locking itself, both economically and politically. Clearly, it is a lack of vision, anticipation, strategy, and tactics. Probably, I'm saying it's a guess, the brilliant results obtained during the war of liberation by an active diplomacy and the guerrilla technique of harassment, illustrated by the famous movie La Bataille d'Alger, continue to serve as a model for the Algerian strategists, forgetting in passing that we are no longer in the 50s. The results are unfortunately far from expectations. Of course, the external enemy is present. We always said that, and we told by the hidden hand. But this is not a reason to focus only on a defensive position, both politically and economically. Those are the issues that civil society and political parties, but also the business community, are struggling to address in a responsible manner with the public authorities. Yet, debate and consultation are the only way to the development, and we at CARE are a strong believer that a better future is possible in this country, and we are working hard on it by always trying to advocate that other paths exist and are possible. But in the meantime, let's celebrate the 60th independence anniversary by inspiring the new generation and giving them the expected hopes. As you understand, I'm not giving you a full picture of the situation of the Algerian economy. Everyone knows it. You can go through the report of the World Bank and whatsoever. And it's very difficult to explain all the things that this country is going through since the 60s. We at CARE are very critical toward the political, the economical policy chosen. We are working on that. We try to argue and to discuss with the government and give them some strong argument to change probably the way they address the economy. But really, it's very difficult because we have to overcome many dogma. So again, let's be fair with this country. This country, we couldn't say hydrocarbon. Why hydrocarbon? Hydrocarbon are the main source of revenue of this country, etc. We all know why we are facing all those problems. We all know why this country is becoming more and more like what we call a pivot country in the region, the size of a continent, all those resources, the location, the actual situation in the world, in the region, in the Mediterranean area, all things combined have a huge influence on the political and economical development of this country. So let's help this country. We are working on that. We love Algeria, but we don't want to continue the way it was now going. And we are sure that by being more and more active and more responsible in the way we do things, we can probably reach some positive results. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Salim. Like I said at the beginning of the in the sort of introductory remarks before opening up, please share your name, affiliation, and any short questions, and we'll call upon you shortly, and we can unmute you.
Sorry, I'm not hearing you very well. What did you say?
I'm speaking to everybody just to share name, affiliation, and short question, and we'll be coming to Q&A shortly. Can you hear me now? No? Salim?
No, I'm not hearing you very well. Say it again.
No, I'm speaking to everybody to share their name, affiliation, and question shortly. And just to come back to Hugh, Zahia, and Salim, we ended on a fairly rosy picture. Many people who may be watching this or listening in later might suggest, and we all try to be objective. Objectivity is subjective. Could we speak to maybe missed opportunities? We heard a little about achievements and failures, and Salim ended on a positive note, which I commend. And of course, we all wish for a prosperous Algeria, which would have a neighborhood effect. But what have been some of the missed opportunities, thinking 62 through now? Are there key moments that strike you that could have taken Algeria in a more positive direction, economically, politically, socially, foreign policy-wise? Who'd like to come in on that first?
I can take and give you a very explicit example. When we talk about computer science, Algeria was ahead of all the country of Africa in the 60s and in the beginning of the 70s. They have very good engineers, etc. And all of a sudden, we don't know what happened at the end of the 80s. Algeria decided, first of all, to declare that all that has to do with computer has to be totally controlled by the government, the army, or whatsoever of the security. And it was seen as a threat for the country. And all of a sudden, all the efforts made between the 60s, the 70s, the end of the 60s, the 70s and the 80s fall down, and the country started going back in the ranking of, now you call it digitalization, but the penetration of computer in the economical system and also within the society. So this is a huge missing opportunity. Could you imagine that we have, if I'm going to say that to every one of you, you wouldn't believe me. We have produced a software with Microsoft. You heard me, with Microsoft at the end of the 80s in Redmond, California, and the packaging of the software mentioned clearly. This software was produced by Microsoft and ENSC Algeria, a public institution. Could you imagine? It was a bilingual, you call it Office now, but it's a package that contains a Word and a spreadsheet, and it's a Word and a spreadsheet. And bilingual, you can use it either in French, English, and Arabic, and mix everything. We missed that opportunity. We didn't continue the relation. We stopped everything in the 80s. So computer-wise, we have missed, we have failed. It's a disaster.
Thank you for that optimistic note, Slim. And I'd hazard a guess that the role of brain drain, which is something in the diaspora, something which we could maybe come into shortly, or brain gain, which seemed to be a potentiality for a minute in 2019 before there seemed to be a reduction in optimism. But Hugh or Zahia, did you want to come in on this? Zahia, please.
If I may, on missed opportunity, yes. Personally, the Iraq movement actually was a movement that really made Algerians aware of so many missed opportunities, one of which is a return into a democratic way of governance immediately after independence. The FLN, when it took the fight for the liberation of the nation, was made of many tendencies that came together. The communists, the Islamists, different parties came together for one aim, which was to liberate the nation. One missed opportunity was that after the nation won its independence in 1962, those parties would be allowed to be as they were before, and that the FLN will become a party like any other. And it wouldn't be the FLN, because the FLN, the Front Libération Nationale, was to liberate the nation. The nation is liberated. That party should go to the, to retire and allow a political version of it to compete with other tendencies. And then Algeria would have been a democratic country from word go. This would have allowed multiplicity of ideologies, of languages, and then go in the right direction instead of fighting each other about Arabizing the country, which was for me a waste of time, trying to Arabize a country of illiterate people in 1962. That was really a waste of energy and a waste of time. The country, the people, 97% of Algerians couldn't read and write. What are we talking about? That immediately alienated the Francophones, who were the majority. And ironically, those who were preaching Arabization could not even read or write in Arabic. So these are, for me, the missed opportunity. I wish after we won independence, we became a democratic country with many parties. And with that, we would have achieved a lot more.
Thank you, Zahir. Hugh, you wanted to come in, please?
Yes, I'm well aware that many Algerians feel, as Zahia, that there was an opportunity missed in 1962. I'm conscious of the extent to which Algeria was in total chaos in 1962. You know, millions of people uprooted from their homes because of the French army's regroupment strategy, the sudden abrupt departure of hundreds of thousands of Europeans, creating a vacuum that immediately sucks people into the city center in Algiers and in Oran in particular. This was enormous economic difficulties, vacuums at the level of management in all sections of the economy. I think this was a situation where democracy really didn't stand a chance, that it was almost inevitable that the leaders produced by the War of Liberation would have authoritarian reflexes at that moment, and would also tend to be very reliant on the Egyptian model, the Nasser model of, if you like, revolution from above, militaristic decision-making. And of course, Ben Bella was very close to Nasser. So I can't help thinking there was something kind of inevitable about the missing of that particular opportunity, if it was one. I know how sorry Algerians are about that. More recently, where I think there were genuine opportunities that went begging for no good reason, where you can't really explain easily the missing of the opportunity, I'm struck by the debate that did not happen but should have happened under Bouteflika, when he announced in a rather provocative way that historic or revolutionary legitimacy was over. That he had this phrase "tab jananu." He was talking about the generation, or the 2 or 3 age cohorts that fought in the war, who had traded on their historic legitimacy to justify their holding high office, and how that was all coming to an end. And that was true. It was coming to an end. People were dying. That generation was leaving. And there should have been a debate in Algeria about the implications of that for the political system. And there was no debate at all. And I thought that was really a very striking symptom of the uselessness of the political parties, all of them, the so-called opposition parties in addition to the others. That was a debate that should have happened, that still hasn't happened. Well, people forever talking about legitimacy without actually addressing that issue. The other thing that I think was an opportunity, perhaps it's easier to explain why it wasn't taken. Algeria had more money than it knew what to do with under Bouteflika for a lot of the time, with the oil price going through the ceiling and the coffers overflowing, the whole national debt being paid off, with leaving plenty to spare. And that was a situation of unprecedented ease financially, which was not taken advantage of to experiment with ways of promoting what needed to be promoting, as I said before, the growth of manufacturing industry outside hydrocarbons. I thought that was an extraordinary failure of the Bouteflika regime, given the economic, the financial, the beneficial financial situation. So those are two, in my view, missed opportunities relatively recently.
Hugh, just to come back on your point on the higher end years of 2000, one would argue, and I'd assume Slim would agree, is one of the big missed opportunities was developing a sovereign wealth fund worthy of the name. And if that was the case, then one could argue path dependence and ideological bent or slant stifled the ability to develop a Kuwait Investment Authority or Qatar Investment Authority for the rainy days. You mentioned Ben Bella, Hugh, and there's a famous quote where Ben Bella refers to Castro as his brother, Nasser as his teacher, who you just alluded to, and Tito as his friend or example. Slim, Zahia, Hugh, who are Algeria's examples today? Do we have a benchmark? What do we want to be? What are the benchmarks?
Very, 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 very difficult to answer, because up to now we didn't have that famous debate that Mr. Hugh Roberts referred to. It's a discussion toward what was the projet de société, I don't know the right word in English for that, we are aiming at. We need to debate what society we want, in what society we want to live. We didn't put that on the table, but because of the famous 5 pillars that I have addressed at the beginning, you couldn't challenge the 5 pillars. It's impossible. If you started challenging the 5 pillars, you immediately seen as an opponent, and you could be really hurt in your day life. And we don't, who wants to be hurt like that? Probably young generation has to open the debate, but not people above 60 years old and more. They are at the end of their life. You know, it's we have great hopes for Algeria. Our great hopes come from the fact that we have a young generation that started being really aware about what is happening around the world, what they want, but until now they don't know how to express really in which society they want to live. Yesterday I had a discussion with the president of a political party, and she's telling me it's very difficult to attract people in a political party. Why? Because no one wants to be involved in politics. Why no one wants to be involved in politics? Because politics immediately was labeled as opponent. Opponent to what? Opponent to what? We want to live in a wealthy country, in a happy country. We want to be in our country. We don't want to see all those youth crossing the Mediterranean Sea because they don't have any hope. Because we are not part of the game. We are not expressing our thoughts. We are not debating on what we really want in our society. So really, there's a lot of things has to be done in terms of what Mr. Hughes said. Again, sorry for that, to repeat, the dialogue. Every time the authorities open the dialogue, they choose the people they want to discuss with. They don't open the dialogue with all the society, which is very strange. They don't have to be afraid. They have an incredible army. They have a lot of money. They have a lot of supporters within the international community. Even country that are against what is happening in Algeria supports our authorities. In fact, because Algeria is very important strategically in the region. We don't want to hit, this is the most important sentence. We don't want to have a destabilized Algeria. No one in the world, from the North Pole to the South Pole, east part or west part on this earth, no one wants to have a destabilized Algeria. So Algeria is an open door for the sub-Saharan people. Algeria could destabilize all the Maghreb area, Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, Niger, Mali, Egypt. So who want to this country be destabilized? No one. So we have to go step by step to reach what we want to reach is a different country, a country where I don't like the word democracy. I don't like the word. Now, I'm a Democrat, but I don't like the word democracy, because every time you speak about democracy, everyone treats you like an opponent. We have to change the word, that word. An egalitarian, a society that is respectful, a society where you are free to do what you want in terms of as an entrepreneur or whatsoever. Yes, you call it democracy, but I think we must invent a new word that didn't hurt authoritarian regime. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Zahia, did you want to add to that?
Yes, of course. I mean, it's a very pertinent question. Observing the social movements, especially when people go on demonstrations from the Black Decade until the Iraq movement, what I have seen personally is the people shout for an Algeria that is Algerian. I remember in the when we, especially we women, demonstrated against in 1992, I was in a demonstration and we were shouting high and loud, La Iran, La Kabul, 𝐀𝐥𝐿 𝐀𝐥𝐿. No Iran, no Kabul, Algeria is Algerian. And in the Hirak movement, what I have seen is La Sharqiyya, La Gharbiyya, 𝐀𝐥𝐿 𝐀𝐥𝐿. Neither Eastern nor Western Algeria is Algerian. So I think Algerians, they want to really scream high and loud for their particularity. We are not followers, and I have to say it with pride, we are leaders. When they say that the Hirak is part of the Arab Springs, I say high and loud, no, it is not. This is a beginning of another new movement, which is pacifist, which is not violent. I mean, how could you sustain a movement over a year with no violence, showing exemplary patterns of behavior by the people? Okay, so this is the birth of another movement. Let's not forget that the Hirak.
If I were to be polite and push back on you and say maybe it's because we learned our lessons from the 90s, right?
Well, I'm coming to that. In fact, the 90s is the equivalent of the spring, or these Arab Springs or so-called springs. Algerians went out in 1988 to do their so-called spring, never called it spring because it was in October, and none of the Arab so-called springs were springs. You could see the results of these movements. They were all movements that were aborted, and in fact, Arabs are not doing better off than before. In some countries, they were hoping the past could come back. Do you see what I'm trying to say? So maybe this Hirak is a birth of a new movement that will be followed 20 years later, when a level of maturity where you could demonstrate for your rights, for your identity in a peaceful manner would come. So coming back to the question where Algeria wants to be, Algeria wants to be itself with multiplicity of languages, of cultures, of identities. We have been a melting pot of civilizations, of cultures, of identities, and that should be seen as a richness rather than a weakness. This is really what we want to achieve. And I hope the Hirak is not dead, is not finished. It will continue, and somehow one day when there is a level of a maturity between the people in power and those in the street, because at the moment, it's those in the street that have a higher level of maturity than those who are governing us, unfortunately, and this is the situation.
Thank you, Zahia. Oh, sorry, Slim, please.
Very short.
Two finger, not one.
Very short sentence. For me, it's very sad to see Algerian researcher in North America saying that Hirak is totally influenced by foreign countries. Every country could have influence, and then they proposed to the Algerian authority to stop the support of international organization or NGOs to the Algerian Association of the civil society. It's very sad that everyone is applauding that kind of researcher in North American university. For sure, you are living in democracy. And we couldn't challenge those people because they are in line with what the authority think of. No discussion with the civil society. Why? I don't know why. I really don't know why. I really wanted to understand why they refuse to open a real dialogue with the civil society in Algeria.
Yeah, on state capacity and pluralism, we can come back to it. But I'd like to now start opening up questions. We have a question. The first question is not from Hamdi Salami, who is showing a comment, but rather from Tariq H. Tariq H, would you like to come off mute in a couple of seconds, or I'll read it on your behalf? The question is, what is the cost for nations in the wider Maghreb for non-cooperation with Morocco, which must, of course, allude to Algeria, given a closed border of some coming up to 28 years in August. And I know Slim has done a lot of work on this, and Meth. You have, in the chat, for the benefit of viewers, quantified the cost as 2% of GDP. But could you maybe provide some qualitative insight on that in terms of business, in terms of identity, in terms of micro and meso level, not just a macro level picture?
Are you asking me to do that?
In as quick fashion as you can, yes.
Yeah, so sorry, there is a journalist called Francis Gilles, very famous. He used to write in the Financial Times, who had launched this idea of the cost of non-Maghreb. We had a long discussion before he launched that idea, and he went through all the figures, etc., and he imagined what could be an open Maghreb, and he said it's between 1% and 2% of GDP. Is it true? Is it false? I couldn't say. We don't have. No one has led a real study on that. But in the Maghreb Economic Forum, we work hardly on that by presenting the three economies, not the five, but three economies, Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. And we tried to show that the synergy between the three countries could have a huge impact on their GDP. Huge impact meaning most probably an impact above 2%. But it needs a more sophisticated work, analyzing what are the complementarity, the synergies between the two countries in details, and also reducing the competition between the countries. Yes. Could you imagine in the health, in the medicament, the
pharmaceutical sector?
Yeah, this sector, and the number of plants you have in Algeria, the number of plants you have in Morocco, the number of plants you have in Tunisia, if you sum up all those plants, you have more plants than France. It's totally crazy. And they didn't do any research. They only assemble products or do something like that. They are not coming with some inventions or things like that for a new medicine. And in many sectors, we have the same issue. There's huge competition, and this competition was, let's say, maintained or fostered by European countries. So this will not help the Maghreb integration. This will really a real reason to maintain the statu quo within the region.
Thank you, Slim.
Thank you.
We could probably do a full conference on that, but complementarity comes up, comparative advantage, competitiveness, coordination, and all of the C's, as well as the role of the Mediterranean Sea. But the role of subsidies, the economies of scale that could have been one. I mean, it goes on and on and on. The potential benefits at micro and meso level, and learning effects. We speak of Erasmus. We had a brief with. What was it, in Ibn Battuta, Ibn Khaldun program? There are so many areas which are unfortunate, but again, we can come back to that another time unless he wanted to come in on that. One thing, and Masali Hajj is another discussion and his vision, but I wanted to call on Brendan Novell, PhD candidate at University of Montreal. Brendan, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Please, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, so just have a question. So thank you for the presentation first, insightful presentations that you gave. So just want to ask a question on the Algerian-French relations. So in Algeria and France, governments and politicians have been regularly using history and historical resentment for domestic purpose, and this increases tensions between both countries. So I'm just wondering about the conditions needed to set the table for a real fruitful dialogue and just move on. Or just do you think that history and resentment will just always inevitably be instrumentalized for internal use in the two countries to better rely people, raising nationalism, to find scapegoats, to domestic economic issues, and this just regularly drives up tensions between the two countries.
Thank you, Brendan.
Thank you.
Hugh or Zahia, did you want to start us off on this trillion-dollar question?
Okay, if I must. I'm rather bored by this story of the attempts to get French and Algerian historians to agree on the history of their relationship. I don't see any particular reason why they should agree. The writing of history is the writing of numerous different versions of history from numerous different points of view, many of which are in necessarily and naturally and properly in conflict. What I would like as a historian to see is a development in Algerian writing of Algeria's history. I'd also quite like to see Algerian historians writing French history, not a French version of Algerian history, but I'd like to see Algeria, in a sense, beginning to be a price giver rather than a price receiver in terms of history. Why shouldn't Algerians write the history of England or whatever? We've had French people writing the history of England. But I want to see Algerians, in a way, taking charge of Algerian history and developing an independence of French academics. I'm very struck over the years by what seems to me to be a dismaying and worrying degree of deference I've seen given by Algerian academics to French academics. And it seems to me that there is a process of decolonization here that has not been completed. And I'm going to be a little provocative. I think this is partly the fault of the Algerian government, which it seems to me has long been wary of its own intelligentsia and doesn't want its intelligentsia to assert itself too effectively. An intelligentsia that is to some extent under the thumb of French ideological and academic fashions is an intelligentsia that you can stigmatize more easily if they begin to give you political headaches at home. So I think there is actually a real tangle here. And what is needed is some strong-minded, independent Algerian intellectuals to, in a way, break through a tangle that is holding things back. On the question of relations with France, I think that there has been a tendency for a regime that has long ago run out of key elements of a serious national project to invest in petty nationalist point scoring against France, demanding apologies for this, that, and the other. The Boumediene regime, which was serious about a national project, didn't waste time doing that. I think that there is a kind of, I was very struck by the spectacular event of the Bouteflika regime investing in petty nationalist bickering with Egypt over football matches 10 or so years ago.
We did beat them, Hugh.
You may have beaten them. God was on your side that day. But the point is that this was a degeneration of official nationalism into pettiness. And I was glad to see then Algerian intellectuals signing a petition, signing a statement, dissociating themselves from this and expressing solidarity with their Egyptian counterparts. I thought that was a very good thing for them to have done. So this is a tangle here. And I think that on the question of the attempts to dovetail or reconcile Algerian and French views of their common history, a lot of this is actually an internal affair in France. A lot of what is really at issue is an argument between different French points of view. And I think that insofar as the Algerian authorities have kept a certain distance from that, they've shown good sense, quite frankly. I wouldn't invest in this.
Thank you, Hugh. Zahia, please.
Just briefly, there is formal history and informal history. And from the feminist point of view, women have done a great deal of work looking for another version, which is not the formal history. We have to mention the work of Assia Jabbar, starting from her work through cinema in the Nuba of the women of Montchenouet, where she recorded voices of women who participated in the war and their version of that war, etc., etc., to many more novels that she has written after she dug or she worked on the French archives, the very few that were accessible to her and to many other historians. So she has really tried to shed light, for example, in terms of the women and their roles in the revolution. She tried to even bring to light women who are not known or who are less known than the popular ones that are mediatized by the Battle of Algiers and other media. So I think women have done a lot of work, and the work is ongoing. I have, however, to say how restrictive the work of history is to Algerians in terms of having access to archives, especially the colonial archive.
Thank you, Zahia. Only Slim, you as was mentioned at the beginning during your bio, not to pick on you, you received an award from our French friends across the Mare Nostrum for your work to try and increase exchanges between the two countries.
Not for that reason.
It wasn't. Okay.
No, it wasn't. It was for working on improving the business environment in Algeria. And this, yes, will help probably increase the exchanges between Algeria, but it could increase also the exchanges between the US and Algeria, Italy and Algeria, Spain, European Union, and whatever country. It's not a political sign sent by the French government to the Algerian authority or to the business community. I think because in 𝐘𝐿, in our think tank 𝐘𝐿, we are really working hard in trying to improve the business environment and to reduce the inconsistencies of the decision maker that we are noticing daily here in Algeria, that makes the business community, the international business community, reluctant to invest in our country. In this country, we have a lot of things to do. We have a lot of opportunities. Everyone always says that we have a lot of opportunity. We have a lot of opportunity, but we have also a lot of inconsistency, and we can improve that just by showing strong leadership, a clear direction, a clear vision on what we want, simplify the bureaucracy, and many things like that. We can do it immediately. But as I said before my introduction, the famous invisible genius of the city are working hard to destroy whatever step toward development in this country. Those geniuses are coming from abroad. Those geniuses are internal to the country. Many powers are fighting against each other. Many groups of a group of interest are fighting against each other, not to let this country in peace. And this is from 1960 and probably before even 1960, even during the French occupation, and probably also even during the Turkish occupation, because we forget that we have the Turkish occupation for more than 300 years. So it's a country that always faces huge challenges, and we still are facing huge challenges, and we will continue to live with that. So I think that we have to change our strategies toward challenges. We have to be less emotional and more pragmatic and more in line with what we want, and not in reaction, but in anticipation.
Thank you, Slim. The pushback on that would be that pragmatism compromises principles. Whether we all share those principles or not is an open question, and you referred to 5 at the beginning. And that also transitions very well to the question I'm about to call on from Umberto Provazio. But just before you unmute, Umberto, you had referred to football. And in fact, when we actually won the African Nations Cup a couple of years ago, that's an Algerian we, not a British we, I'm British Algerian. When Algeria won in 2019, there was a wonderful article that came out from a French Algerian at the World Bank, who referred to a football metaphor, which sort of suggested that if you have teamwork, the diaspora, and good leadership, Jamal Belmadi, of course, the coach, you can lead to fulfilling your potential. So it was a wonderful piece. But Umberto, I'd like to come to you, Umberto Provazio from the International Institute for Strategic Studies, IISS. Umberto, are you with us?
Yeah.
Please,
Hello.
could you ask your question? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah. My question is basically on the Abraham Accords and the normalization process, because as the Professor Zahia Ismail was saying before, the comparison between the Arab Spring on one side and the Black Decade on the other was evident, given the role of the political Islam. But political Islam seem in decline. To me, apparently, the electoral results in Tunisia and Morocco, especially last year, seems that now the normalization process is the main issue, which is driving the geopolitics and maybe the politics of the region. And this has been evident in the Maghreb, where the rift between Algeria and Morocco has been aggravated. So I wanted to ask the speakers their view about that.
Thank you. Can I try and just take another question and then we'll put them together? Professor Granara, wonderful question on something dear to my heart. Please.
I just wanted to ask if the absence of developing a tourist industry might have been considered a great missed opportunity in Algeria.
Great.
Just to take
Thank you. Slim has an opinion on that, but we'll come back to Slim. Who wants to pick up on, again, these growing fissures with the changing or reconfiguration of regional dynamics? Morocco, Sudan, Bahrain, UAE to join, of course, Egypt and Jordan, Turkey before all of the Arabs, and maybe other countries to join soon. Slim referred to the Palestine question as being non-negotiable. How is that going to change Algeria's relationship with its neighbors? And what is your view on these dynamics and how they impact Algeria? Would Hugh or Zahia like to come in on that first?
You know, Adel, those 5 pillars are really difficult to challenge. It's not difficult. They are, for the moment, totally impossible to challenge.
Yes.
You couldn't talk about Arabization. You couldn't talk about Islam. You couldn't talk about the Palestinian cause and Israel normalization. You couldn't talk about Occidental Sahara. It's impossible. It doesn't mean that I want to talk. I don't want. The society is like that. The society was built around those 5 pillars since 60 years. Could you imagine daily you eat potatoes daily. After 60 years, someone come and tells you, no, it's bad to eat potatoes, or probably you should eat something else. You would say no, because you get used with that. So listen, the question is very difficult to address from my point of view, because you have a large part of the society is really conservative, very traditional, and the question of Al-Quds, of Jerusalem, is really emotional for them, more than in Middle East. Could you imagine? Yesterday, I had a dinner with Middle Eastern people. They told me Eid al-Adha, when we slaughter the sheep, it's in less than 10 days. It's not something like we noticed here in Algeria. In Algeria, it's more than important. If someone that is poor couldn't have the money or the means to buy sheep to slaughter during Eid al-Adha, he will go and try to have that money by any means. He will borrow money from friends, from the family, from whatsoever, and he will have this sheep at home. So it's a society that was built around those pillars. How it will change? Probably, I told you, the new generation will gradually change few things, but not all of them. It will take hundreds of years or more. And I'm not really optimistic about a major change in the cultural behavior of the Algerian society. And there is a lot of pressure on the Algerian society to change toward Palestinian cause to change toward Israeli cause and what's Israel normalization, etc. I think that the countries that are doing so are making a wrong bet, because Algerian will not accept that.
Yeah,
definitely. They have to change their strategy.
Thank you, Slip. Hugh, you wanted to come in, please.
Yes, I do. Can you hear me? Am I on?
We can, perfectly.
Good.
Perfectly.
I think a point I'd very much like to make here is that the Algerian state has its own constitutive principles. And one of those principles that is absolutely central to Algeria's state tradition is support for the principle of self-determination. And I think that it's actually necessary for Algeria to maintain its support for Palestinian self-determination. I think that I take the view that in the long term, the game isn't over with Palestine. That Israel is, there's grounds for thinking Israel is really overreaching and going much further than it's in its own long-term interest to go, possibly even subverting itself. It's certainly losing a lot of the support that it used to be able to take for granted. So I think Algeria needs to maintain its position on Palestine, and that it will not lose from doing so. Now, the question arises, it seems to me, given the pressure that has been put on Algeria via Morocco with Israel's diplomatic offensive in the Maghreb and in relation to Morocco in particular. And I think, well, that's the kind of challenge where a state like Algeria simply has to show itself to be steadfast and capable of weathering that kind of pressure. It doesn't have a serious alternative to being steadfast. And I think the Algerians have demonstrated their ability to be steadfast when they really need to be. So I'm hoping that I just want to say courage, stick to your principles there. On the question of Morocco, however, let me make, if I may, a second point here. I'm very struck that the Algerian position on the Western Saharan question, which of course should be understood to be a colossal failure by the UN. The UN has had responsibility for resolving this since 1991 and has completely failed. I'm struck that Algeria's formal position continues to be simply support for the UN process, without actually developing what seems to me to be an entirely justifiable line of critique of the UN's performance. And I'm puzzled by that, because one of the features of the UN process is that on the one hand, it focuses exclusively on the question of self-determination and the need for a referendum for that reason, while at the same time, because of the matter is dealt with by the Security Council under Chapter 6, not Chapter 7, or is it the other way around? In other words, on a non-coercive basis, it actually gives Morocco the right to veto any referendum that may be planned. And this is, of course, paralysis. And a feature of this is that Algeria actually had a second ground of principle in objecting to Morocco's annexation of the Western Sahara, which was the principle of uti possidetis. That's to say, the principle of not violating frontiers inherited from the colonial era, but agreeing that they can only be changed by negotiation. And that is the position of the African Union. And that position, which is a second element of Algeria's position, goes completely unarticulated because of the way the UN has been mishandling things. So I'm puzzled that Algeria isn't actually is not actually articulating the whole of its principled position in this matter. And I think that if it did so, that would help it withstand the pressure it is now under.
Thank you, Hugh. For those that were in Algeria during 2019, Palestinian flags, Algeria flags, wrapped and meshed together. And I think on the self-determination point, whether you're secular or Islamist, to use that generic fault line, you capture the whole population. It's the one country I've personally seen in the region and worked and lived in a few on the way, that it really does capture from one border to the other and from north to south to east to west. Unless he had a quick point, we do have a hard stop at 6:30. So what 6:30 or 1:30 EST. I'd like to just ask in your sort of last 30 seconds, 45 seconds each, two things. If you could give us on the spot, very difficult, Hugh, be ready, Zahia, Slim. If you could give us one ingredient that the Algerian society or state could achieve in the coming years with a little bit of intelligence, capacity, aptitude, which is a lower hanging fruit. And the second is, and I'm going to ask everybody on the call, if you could just put in the chat the word positive status quo, words, positive status quo or worse on where Algeria is going to be in 2042, when we're going to be nearly 60 million or 55 million. So in your last few seconds, one ingredient and status quo, positive or worse off, starting with Zahia.
Gender equality is a must. The society can only improve when this women's resentment about these inequalities are resolved. I am very optimistic. I think things might brighten up. This is only 60 years after independence. A lot has been achieved, and we can't ask from a young country such as Algeria more than it has achieved. If you visit Algeria and look for yourself, you will see that the people in Algeria in 2022 are not those of 1962, when hardly anybody had access to electricity, water, gas, decent homing, schooling, etc., etc. A lot has been achieved. I am very hopeful for the future.
So putting a positive, housing is something that we didn't mention, a housing revolution, if there ever was one.
Definitely.
Hugh.
Two things. When I was teaching in Algeria, I was very struck by the tremendous thirst for knowledge of my pupils in a lycée. And the Algerians are on a learning curve. They proceed in fits and starts, but they're still going up the curve. And I'm optimistic, I'm hopeful that they will find ways to think through and solve the problems they face in an empirical process. The second thing is, I would very much urge Algerian intellectuals with an interest in particular in political change to start reflecting seriously on issues of the constitution. There is a constitutionalist tradition in Tunisia, which has been a very important premise of the Tunisian revolution. There doesn't need to be such a tradition in Morocco because God has given them a king. But Algeria doesn't have a king. It needs to think about constitutional matters. It has not done so. And the revolutionary tradition has been a kind of alibi for not thinking about constitutional matters. They need to start thinking about constitutional matters and debate them. And that will be part of a necessary learning process.
And Hugh, positive by 2042, status quo or worse off?
Positive, inshallah.
Inshallah, wow.
Positive. Yeah.
And Slim, last word to you before I give you a mini tally.
Three things, you can say many things, but three things that believe in the Algerian. I think the Algerian authority must believe in the Algerian, which they are not. Second, they must open a dialogue with the civil society. It's not yet open. And the Algerian authority must show an openness to the world. The country is still seen as a closed country. So we need to open, we need to attract more people, that people come. I'm not talking about investors. Even the Algerian population must see more foreigners in the country, moving around, crossing the different part of the country, visiting Algeria. Even if they are not tourists, they could be researchers, they could be teacher at university, whatever. But believe in Algerian, open dialogue, and open to the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Slim. We did miss Bill's question.
That's all right. We can think about that for the next time.
Think about
I
it in the
think
future.
we're running off. Let me take the chair here.
Bill,
And
can I just have 5 seconds to say that 52% told us that we're going to have a positive outcome by 2042. 48% are status quo, according to my quick tally, and no negative. Thank you so much, speakers.
Very good vote.
Slim,
And I
over
thank
to
you
you,
all.
Bill.
I just wanted to thank you, Adil, and thank all the panel for this absolutely wonderful, very enriching and positive, uplifting webinar. And hopefully we'll do another one soon. God bless.